Okay, now we're going to move on to the integument. The integument is the skin, and so finally we're at a structure that we can see and understand. So the integumentary system is comprised of the cutaneous membrane and accessory structures. Now, the cutaneous membrane has two components. It has the epidermis and the dermis. Epidermis is exposed to the outside, so it is an epithelial tissue. It is a stratified squamous epithelium. The dermis, however, not exposed, so it is a connective tissue layer, has two layers to it. In fact, it has areolar connective tissue and then dense, irregular connective tissue in it. The accessory structures are like hair, nails, glands, sensory receptors, erector pili muscles, and the cutaneous plexus, which is a network of blood vessels. So if you notice, we have all four primary tissue types here. Epithelium in the epidermis, connective tissue in the dermis. We have muscle tissue, the erector pili muscles, and we have nervous tissue because we have sensory receptors and nerve fibers down in here. That's why we had to learn them all in the last unit, because here they all are. Okay, below the dermis is another layer called the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. It is not part of the integument. I highlight that because that is a common test question. What's the integument? It's the epidermis and the dermis only. It separates the integument from deep fascia. Deep fascia is connective tissue that lines another structure like muscle. All right, so we don't think about the functions of the skin very often, except to, keep the outside out and the inside in. But we are going to protect. We're going to keep from losing fluids and dehydrating. It is an excretory organ. We lose water, salts, and other metabolic waste this way, organic waste. Maintains our body temperature. It produces pigments like melanin that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. We make vitamin D with our skin that is important for calcium metabolism. I'll get to that in the skeletal system. It stores fats for us, which is energy reserves, and it is a sensory organ because we sense things like hot, cold, pressure, pain, all that kind of stuff with it. All right, so let's look at the epidermis. We actually have two kinds of epidermis. We have thin skin and we have thick skin. Well, thin skin has 4 layers to it, and it is found almost everywhere, all over the body, okay? Each one of those layers is called a strata, and thin skin has the characteristic of having hair associated with it. Not just the hair on your head, but fine hairs that you can't hardly even feel all over your body. Now, thick skin is only found on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, and it has the distinction of being hairless. No hair found here. And it has 5 layers, okay? And it is going to be important to know your layers, know them in order, and know them by a description and what's going on in there. All right, so looking at the epidermis in general, we don't have blood vessels. Remember, epithelial, it's avascular, no blood vessels. So it has to get its nutrients from the level below, from the dermis, okay? So the cells that are going to have the highest needs for nutrients, gases, and so the highest metabolic rate are going to be closest to that dermis. It takes about 7 to 10 days for cells to move from the deepest layer up to the most superficial layer. Now that most superficial layer, the stratum corneum, is pretty thick, so it takes another few days to get through that layer. So basically, it takes about 3 weeks for cells to be born and then be sloughed away, okay? So those numbers are important, that it takes about 7 to 10 days to get to the outer layer, about 3 weeks from birth to death. And this is why your suntan doesn't last, because your suntan, those cells get pigmented down in the deepest layers, and about 3 weeks later, those cells that got pigmented are flying away. All right, so now let's take a look at those layers. The deepest one is the stratum basal, or basale, some people say. It is down here, this deepest layer of this dark pink staining tissue. These are the dermal papilla. These papilla are bumps here that interdigitate with epidermal ridges. We call these the ridges, and these are the dermal papilla. They kind of form hills and valleys. Okay, dermal papilla are there to, one, increase surface area for the cells down in this stratum basal, and it helps hold the dermis and the epidermis together. If it was a smooth line, they'd tend to slide over one another. Down here in the stratum basal, we're going to find the basal cells. These cells are stem cells, and they are continuously producing new cells by mitosis. In fact, they don't have a G0 phase. Their job is to reproduce. So they just keep going through G1, S1, G2, mitosis, back to G1. They just skip G0 completely. All right, and so one of those daughter cells stays down in there and the other one gets pushed above. There's also some cells scattered around down in here called Merkel cells or tactile discs, and those are there for, they're neuroepithelial cells or specialized cells that can detect stimuli such as light pressure. I want to emphasize that these layers, while they have distinct features to them, they're really just stages in the life cycle of a cell, okay? These cells get pushed up, up, up as the cells below them divide and they migrate their way towards the surface. They are dying and they're producing different proteins inside the cell along the way, which gives us these distinct layers. But it's not like these are different cells up in here. And they are the same cells, just at different stages of their life. All right, so now the stratum basal is real close to that dermis where all the nutrients are. As the cells are pushed further away, they start to dehydrate. The cells pass along nutrients and fluids by way of diffusion, and the bottom cells are going to take what they need and pass on any extra. And then the cell after that is going to take what it needs and pass on the extra. And after a couple layers, there isn't much extra. So the cells start to dehydrate. Well, the cell still has a cytoskeleton inside. It's kind of trying to hold up the walls while it's collapsing. And the cells start to go through a phase where they kind of look like a grape turning into a raisin, where they kind of fold in on themselves. And they get these little funny corners and kinks on them. So it got referred to as the spiny layer. It's only about 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes. That's not an important number, but there are several layers in here. We'll also find immune cells called dendritic cells down in here that are looking around for any microorganisms that might have made their way through maybe a paper cut or something. And they're also looking for any cancerous cells that might have been made along the way. All right, so after the spiny layer, we get to the grainy layer, the stratum granulosum. At this point, the cells, they're done dividing. They are drying up, and they figure, well, I'm a goner. I might as well start turning everything around here I can into keratin and another protein called keratohyalin. The cells are dehydrating, the cytoskeletons are collapsing inside, so they're thinner and flatter at this point. Because of all the keratin, they're becoming less permeable and more water resistant. And then we get to this special layer. This is the layer that's missing in thin skin, the stratum lucidum, or the clear layer. If you're thinking clearly, you're thinking lucidly. It's only found in thick skin. It's a very thin layer. So if we look down here, here's the stratum granulosum, that big dark purple line. And then just above it is a place where the stain is just a little lighter than the stain above it. Okay, so it's not perfectly clear. It just doesn't take up the stain as much at this point. And it's very densely packed with lots of keratin and keratohyalin at this point. As the cells progress upwards, they enter the stratum corneum. It is the outermost layer. It is the thickest layer, about 30 cells thick at this point. The cells are dead, and they are full of keratin. They're like little keratin shingles at this point. They're still held very tightly together to one another by a cell junction called a desmosome. A desmosome is like a protein button on either side inside of the cell membranes, and we kind of sew protein fibers across it. So it's very tight together. And this is why when you get a sunburn, you peel off layers of your skin in big sheets because of those desmosomes like holding this all together. We do lose water. Even though we're water resistant, we're not waterproof. We lose water all the time through our skin. Now, the sweat that you feel, like when you're working out and you're sweating, you're like, whew, I can feel that. Okay, that's called sensible perspiration because you can sense it, you can feel it. Okay, there is perspiration that we don't feel. It's basically evaporation through our skin. If you want to feel it, you could take some plastic wrap and wrap it around your arm and leave it there for a few minutes, take it off, and then your skin will feel damp at that point. And that's because the plastic has prevented that evaporation and has caught that insensible perspiration. We don't sense it. That's why it's called insensible. All right, so you need to know your layers. You need to know them in order. We might ask, what order are they in from superficial to deep? Or deep to superficial? You need to know what's going on at each one of those layers. So if we describe it, saying at this layer, the cells are very darkly staining because of granules of keratohyalin and keratin in them. You should be able to come up with, stratum granulosum. All right. So know your layers, and I will see you in the next video.